Ancient Matthew Papyrus discovered. Oldest known Testament fragments reveal 2000-year-old words of Jesus. Hidden within the historic old library of Magdalen College at University of Oxford lie three tiny papyrus fragments that have stirred enormous scholarly and theologically interest. Known as the Magdalen Papyrus P64, these fragile scraps are widely regarded as some of the oldest surviving portions of the New Testament ever discovered. Now let's dive deeper and explore every layer of this story on our AI podcast.
Okay, so picture this for a second.
Mm-hmm.
You are at Oxford University, but you're not in one of those like ultra-modern, high-tech labs. You know the ones I mean.
With the glass walls and the biometric scanners.
Exactly, none of that. And you aren't even in a lecture hall. You are in the old library at Magdalen College.
Which, I mean, that is an experience all on its own. It's incredibly atmospheric.
Right, it's quiet. It smells like old paper, dust, history, and you are there to see one of the most significant treasures in the entire world.
Yeah.
Now, usually for something this high profile, something this valuable, you'd expect, I don't know, lasers, alarms.
Maybe velvet rope or two.
At least.
Right, the kind of security usually reserved for the crown jewels, or at least a very thick, bulletproof glass case with like a humidity sensor beeping in the corner.
But that is not what happens here. Not at all. Instead, you are looking at a quiet, unassuming moment that connects us directly to antiquity. Today, we are doing a deep dive into the Magdalen Papyrus.
Or P64 if you want to be technical about it.
Let's stick with Magdalen Papyrus. It sounds cooler.
Fair enough. But look, this is a heavy topic, quite literally in terms of historical weight. We are talking about what are believed to be the oldest surviving fragments of the New Testament anywhere on the planet.
Specifically, the Gospel of Matthew.
Exactly.
It is, honestly, it's mind-blowing to think about. We are talking about papyrus, that has survived for roughly 2,000 years.
2 millennia.
I mean, I have receipts in my wallet from last week that are already fading.
Right. An organic material like papyrus. It usually decays so rapidly, moisture, light, insect, everything is trying to destroy it.
Nature wants it gone.
Exactly. So
Yeah.
the fact that we have it at all, it's basically a miracle of archaeology.
So here's our mission for this deep dive. We're going to look at these fragile little scraps. We want to understand how they survived, what they actually say, because the text itself is pretty dramatic, and why these tiny pieces of papyrus are currently completely reshaping the debate on when the Gospels were actually written.
It really is a detective story, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's about paleography, history, and just the physical thrill of touching the past.
But before we get to the controversy, and there is a big one, let's talk about the experience of actually seeing it.
Okay.
We have this account from Dr. Jeremiah Johnston. Now, he's a scholar, so he knows the significance. He goes to the Bodleian Library at Oxford, and he's expecting this massive, pompous reveal.
Which is a reasonable expectation. This is a priceless artifact. You expect some ceremony,
Yeah.
maybe white gloves, and a whole team of curators hovering over you.
Completely. But instead, get this, the fragments are brought out in this modest frame. Johnston actually described it as looking literally like a shoebox.
A shoebox.
A shoebox.
Wow. That is such a grounding image. You have this item that could change how we view history, and it's just there in a simple container.
It almost makes it feel more real, doesn't it?
Yeah,
If it were on a pedestal with spotlights, it becomes an object. In a box, it's just papers.
exactly. And that lack of barrier is what makes the encounter so intense. Can you describe it for us, for the listener's mind's eye? What are we actually looking at here?
Imagine small, tattered scraps. They aren't whole pages. They are browned with age. That deep, rich, antique brown where the fiber has just oxidized over centuries.
Right.
They are incredibly fragile to the touch. The ink is faded, but it's still legible. It's not a polished museum piece. It looks like exactly what it is, a survivor.
And Johnston's reaction wasn't just distinct, it was emotional. He didn't just say, oh, that's nice.
No.
He described it as transcendent. He even used the word transformational.
Why do you think that is? I mean, he's seen old things before. He's an expert.
Well, think about the context. He was left alone with it. Just him and this physical link to the very first generations of Christianity.
Just sitting there.
Just sitting there.
Yeah.
There's a psychological weight to that. You are looking at a copy of a copy of a copy. You're breathing the same air as an object that might have been held by someone who knew the apostles.
It collapses the time gap.
Precisely. It turns history into a present moment experience.
But we should clarify, it's not like anyone can just walk in off the street and do this, right? I can't just knock on the door at the Bodleian and ask for the shoebox.
No, absolutely not. Please do not try that.
Notes taken.
The notes emphasize that Dr. Johnston had to acquire an elite A reader card at the Bodleian Library just to get this access. That is not easy to come by. You have to be vetted. It's a very restricted circle because, again, if you sneeze the wrong way...
You could damage citery.
Exactly.
So he's sitting there with his A card, staring at this shoebox, looking at these brown scraps. But let's get into the nitty-gritty. What is actually written on them? Because it's not just a random grocery list from antiquity.
No, and that's what makes P64 so special. Sometimes archaeologists find a receipt for grain or a letter about a sick donkey.
Or a tax return.
Right. But this is high drama. These fragments contain text from Matthew chapter 26.
Which is Woodhouse to remind us.
It's the lead up to the Last Supper, the anointing of Jesus at Bethany, the prediction of betrayal. These are some of the most narrative-heavy, emotional moments in the entire gospel.
It is amazing that those are the parts that survived out of everything.
It really is. It feels almost curated by history.
I want to actually read some of what's on there because I think it grounds us in the reality of the artifact. This isn't abstract. These are specific sentences that we can still read today. For example, we have Matthew 26.14.
Wait, that's the moment of Judas bargaining. The fragment reads, "Then one of the 12, the man called Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priests and said, 'What are you prepared to give me?'"
Chills.
Yeah.
Just hearing that, it's the inciting incident of the Passion narrative. And then there's the prediction of the disciples leaving, Matthew 26.31 and 32.
Yes, so the text on the papyrus says, Jesus said to them, "You will all fall away from me tonight, for the scripture says, I shall go ahead of you to Galilee."
And there's one more section about the woman anointing Jesus.
Right. Correct. Matthew 26, verses 7, 8, and verse 10, it describes the woman pouring oil on his head and the disciples getting indignant. The fragment reads, "When they saw this, the disciples said indignantly." And then Jesus' response. Jesus noticed this and said, "Why are you upsetting the woman? What she has done for me?"
It's just incredible to think those specific conversations are preserved on this fiber. It's not just theology, it's a record of an interaction.
And here is where it gets fascinating from a historical milestone perspective. These fragments are the earliest known copies in the world, in the entire historical record, where 3 specific names appear together in writing.
Which names?
Jesus, Peter, and Judas Iscariot.
Wow. So before this piece of paper, we don't have physical proof of those 3 names in the same space.
Not in the same written narrative space, no. Before this, we have nothing physically older. This is the cast list of the Passion, right there in black and white, or brown and faded black.
That brings it home. It's not just a story, it's a record. Now, I want to pivot to something that might seem boring at first glance, but is actually super cool. The technology.
You mean the format of the text?
Yes. We mentioned it's papyrus, not parchment, but it's also a codex.
Right. And this is huge.
Explain this to me. Why does it matter if it's a codex or a scroll? Isn't it just a preference, like choosing between a hardcover and a paperback?
It's much more than preference. It's about utility. In the ancient world, the scroll was the standard. But think about using a scroll.
It's cumbersome.
Extremely. You need 2 hands.
Yeah.
If you want to find a specific passage, you have to unroll the whole thing. It's expensive because you only write on one side.
Okay, so it's like a VHS tape where you have to rewind and fast forward to find the one scene you want.
That is actually a perfect analogy.
Yeah,
yes.
yeah.
Now, the codex is essentially what we call a book today, pages bound together that you can flip through.
So the Magdalen Papyrus is pages.
Exactly. It's written on both sides of the leaf.
Which you can't do with a scroll.
Not easily, and not without risking the ink rubbing off. The significance here is that the codex was a revolutionary technology. It was the smartphone of its day in terms of information density and portability.
Information density, I like that.
Well, it holds more data in a smaller package. The fact that this ancient fragment is a codex tells us that early Christians were early adopters.
They were tech savvy.
In a way, yes. They adopted this new media format to spread their message faster, cheaper, and more efficiently than the established culture, which was still stuck on scrolls. It shows a desire to get the word out. A codex is easier to hide, easier to carry, and easier to use for reference.
That is such a cool detail. It wasn't just about the words, it was about the delivery system. It's like moving from vinyl to MP3s. They realized this new format was better for their mission.
That's a great way to put it. It democratized the reading experience. You didn't need a giant table to unroll a scroll. You could hold it in your hand.
Okay, now we have to get to the controversy, because nothing in history is ever simple. We have the text, we have the format, but when was it written?
The great dating debate. This is where things get heated.
This seems to be the crux of the issue. So how do we even date something like this? I assume we can't just look for a printed in 70 AD stamp on the bottom.
I wish. And we can't easily use carbon dating either.
Why not? I thought that was the gold standard for archaeology.
It is for determining age, but it's destructive. You have to burn a piece of the material to test it.
Oh.
Yeah. With something this small and this priceless, where every millimeter contains a letter, you can't just snip off a corner and set it on fire.
Fair point. I imagine the archivists at Oxford would frown on that.
Highly.
So what do?
We use paleography.
Which is handwriting analysis.
Basically, it's the science of analyzing the strokes, the curves, the way letters are formed. You compare the handwriting on the fragment to thousands of other documents from Egypt, receipts, tax forms, letters that do have specific dates on them.
Like, I paid my taxes in the 12th year of Emperor Nero.
Exactly. If the handwriting on your undated papyrus matches the style of a tax form from the year 150 AD, you can assume the papyrus is from around that time. Handwriting styles change over time, just like fonts do today.
Right, like how you can tell the difference between a font from the 1920s and Comic Sans.
Please don't compare the Gospels to Comic Sans, but yes, exactly.
Okay, so based on this font checking, what's the consensus on the Magdalen Papyrus?
Most scholars place P64 in the late 2nd century AD, so roughly 200 AD.
Which is about 170 years after Jesus.
Right, which is still incredibly old. It's still one of the oldest things we have.
But then comes the plot twist.
Yeah.
Enter Dr. Karsten Peter Thiede,
A German archaeologist who really shook things up in the 90s. He took a much closer look at the handwriting, under a microscope, essentially, and argued that the consensus was wrong. He said the style actually matches documents from a much earlier period.
How early?
He argues for around 70 AD.
Whoa! 70 AD versus 200 AD. That is a massive difference.
It's a seismic shift. It's the difference between history and ancient history.
Let's unpack that. Why does the 70 AD date matter so much? Is it just bragging rights for being older? Or does it change how we understand the text?
It's much more than bragging rights. It goes to the reliability of the text. If Thiede is right, and Dr. Johnston supports this view as well, it means these fragments are contemporaneous with the writing of the Gospels themselves.
So written while it was happening? Or just after?
Written while eyewitnesses to the actual events were potentially still alive. If you're writing about Jesus in 70 AD, there are people walking around Jerusalem or Antioch or Rome who might have seen him.
That completely changes the telephone game theory.
Exactly. That is the skeptic's strongest argument, that the Gospels were written hundreds of years later, after oral tradition had changed the story over and over again. Like whispering a phrase in a circle. By the time it gets back to you, it's different.
But if this papyrus is from 70 AD, that gap disappears.
It implies a much tighter chain of custody for the information. It means the text was set in stone or papyrus very early on. Dr. Johnston believes the evidence supports this very early date. He argues it challenges the skeptics who claim the Gospels are late inventions.
It's a bold claim. But it is a debate, right? Not everyone agrees with Thiede.
Oh, absolutely. It is highly controversial. The consensus among many scholars is still the later date. They argue Thiede's comparisons were a bit selective. But the fact that there is a credible scholarly argument for 70 AD is what makes P64 so explosive. It opens the door to the possibility that we have something from the eyewitness generation.
It's fascinating that a few curves on a letter alpha or omega can shift our understanding of history by a century.
That's the power of paleography. It's analyzing the fingerprint of the scribe.
So we have this incredible object, we know what it says, we know there's a fierce debate about when it was written, but how did it get to Oxford? It didn't just appear there.
No, the provenance, the origin story is a bit of a mystery in itself. We know it started in Luxor, Egypt.
Luxor, the Valley of the Kings, that area.
Right, prime archaeological territory. The dry sands of Egypt are perfect for preserving papyrus. It was acquired around 1901 by a man named Charles Bousfield Hulid. He was a missionary and, conveniently, an alumnus of Magdalen College.
So he buys these scraps in Egypt.
And donates them to his old college in Oxford that same year, 1901.
Do we know where he got them? Like, did he dig them up? Did he buy them at a street market?
That's the frustrating and fascinating part. We don't know exactly how Hulad got them or the specific location of the find. It wasn't a documented excavation like we have today. And that adds this layer of archaeological intrigue. It's like they just surfaced from the sands of time.
It feels very Indiana Jones, buying artifacts in a dusty market in Cairo, wrapping them in a newspaper, and mailing them to England.
Very much so. And Juliet probably didn't realize exactly what he had.
And then has to send them to Oxford. Do they immediately realize, oh my gosh, we have the oldest Matthew in the world?
Not at all. And this is the part that drives historians crazy.
What happened?
Nothing.
Nothing.
He sat in the library, largely unseen, for over a century.
That is wild. They had one of the most significant Christian artifacts in the world, and it was just sitting there.
It happens more often than you'd think. Archives are vast, things get cataloged and forgotten. It wasn't until the 1950s that they were first properly identified, and then Thide came along much later in the 90s to really blow the dust off and start this dating controversy.
It really emphasizes the shoebox nature of it all. It wasn't screaming for attention.
No, it was waiting to be discovered again. It just shows that we don't always know what we have until we look closer.
Let's talk about reliability. We touched on the dating, but Dr. Johnston has a strong take on what this papyrus tells us about the accuracy of the Bible overall.
Yes. His conclusion is that the cumulative evidence, meaning the text, the dating, the codex format, shows that the early church was deeply committed to accuracy.
So not just making it up as they went along.
Right. The existence of these fragments, especially if they are early, pushes back against that idea of a fluid, changing story. It suggests that what was written down was preserved with great care. They didn't just change the words to fit the current political mood. They copied them, character by character.
Because if you believe this is sacred text, you don't mess with the spelling.
Exactly. The reverence for the text ensured its preservation.
And for Johnston and many others, this isn't just an academic exercise. The source mentions a very personal connection.
It does. For believers, Johnston says this isn't just history. He described it as holding truth itself.
That's a powerful phrase.
It reminds them of the core tenets of their faith forgiveness, sacrifice. When you read Jesus died for my sins in a modern paperback, it's one thing. When you see the fragment of the text that has survived 2,000 years of wars, fires, floods, and decay, it becomes a physical bridge.
That image of the bridge is stuck in my head. Faded ink on fraying papyrus bridging a 2,000-year gap.
It really is a whisper from antiquity. It's a very quiet object that speaks very loudly.
So to synthesize this journey, we started in a quiet library in Oxford. We opened a literal shoebox to find these brown, fragile scraps from Egypt.
We read the words of betrayal and loyalty from Matthew 26, the actual names of Jesus, Peter, and Judas together. We saw how the codex format shows early Christians were innovators.
And we dove into the debate. Is it 200 AD or is it 70 AD, practically breathing down the neck of the events themselves?
And regardless of where you land on the date, the fact remains. These 24 lines of text exist. They survived against all odds.
And that leads to the final takeaway for me. It's the power of the physical object. In a digital world where everything is on a screen and can be deleted with a click, there is something shaking about the idea that we can look at the exact same words on the exact same paper that someone was reading in the Roman Empire.
It collapses time. You are standing next to that person from the first century. You are sharing a reading experience.
Yeah.
That is rare magic.
It really is. And here's a thought I want to leave you with. The Magdalen Papyrus sat in that library for 100 years before someone realized it might rewrite history. It makes you wonder,
Oh, I know where you're going.
what other priceless discoveries are currently sitting unnoticed in archives right now? What is sitting in a box, on a shelf, in a basement in London or Cairo or Istanbul, just waiting for the right person to open the lid and look inside?
That is the question. The next big discovery is probably already above ground, just waiting for us to notice it.
Thanks for diving deep with us today.
My pleasure.
Okay, one question for you. If the Magdalen Papyrus truly dates back to the 1st or 2nd century, what does that mean for the argument that the Gospels were written too late to accurately preserve the words of Jesus? Don't forget to comment it. Thanks.